Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. For those of you who are new here, welcome. My name is Kayla and I release new videos every Monday about all things BPD. So if that sounds good to you, be sure to hit the subscribe button down below as well as the bell notification up top. Now, as requested by many of you, today we will be addressing the main differences and similarities between BPD, more specifically quad BPD, and CPTSD. Now, as we know, BPD is a personality disorder, and we see 9 different possible symptoms. So we see things like dysregulated emotions, impulse control issues, fear of abandonment, suicidal ideations, or self-harm. So those are just some of the symptoms. Conversely, with CPTSD is repetitive, repeated, long exposure to trauma. Okay, so it's different from the classic PTSD. And I also want to mention the fact that this is not yet recognized within the DSM. Within the DSM, we just see the common classical PTSD. CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. As I mentioned, it's repetitive exposure to trauma, or things that would potentially trauma you, whereas PTSD, it can be more acute or episodic, meaning that sometimes it just takes the one incident to traumatize us and cause PTSD. CPTSD consists of the same symptoms as PTSD, so things like hypervigilance, avoidance, somatic symptoms, with 3 additional ones. So the 3 would be emotional dysregulation, negative self-cognitions, and interpersonal difficulties. And this is really the thing that overlaps a lot with BPD and then can make it confusing to tell, do I have BPD or do I actually have CPTSD? Some of the factors that increase the likelihood of developing CPTSD would be, as I mentioned, repetitive and long exposure to trauma, and more specifically, according to research, it's having been abused, whether verbally, emotionally, sexually, by a primary caregiver. So let's firstly discuss the similarities between CPTSD and BPD. I'm just going to read off my list because there are quite a few and I want to make sure to not forget any. So some of the things that we do see would be things such as emotional regulation. So there's a lot of anger, there can be avoidance, there can be intense emotions that we don't necessarily know what to do. This is a common symptom for both disorders. Secondly, we see things such as the concept of self, meaning that folks with BPD have a hard time knowing who they are. They have a hard time forming a clear and cohesive identity. We can also see this within CPTSD. Other things, as I had mentioned, we have interpersonal struggles, we have an increased risk of suicide, we have dissociation and self-harm. Okay, so as we can see, if I'm just listing you those symptoms, you wouldn't really know that this would be something else. You would just assume that this is BPD because these are all the symptoms that we do see with that disorder, and yet we're also seeing them with CPTSD, which makes it that much more difficult to know which one do I have? Do I actually have this? Do I have that? Do I have a combination of both? Where do I lie on that spectrum? Okay, so as we just saw, there are a lot of similarities between the two. There's also some key differences which I want to address because I think that it's important to know. The main one, or one of the first ones, would be dealing with emotion regulation. Okay, so even though someone with BPD and CPTSD do have difficulties regulating their emotion, the root cause of it is very different. With someone with BPD, it would be the fear of abandonment, this fear of rejection that might trigger those mood swings, make them feel very volatile and insecure. Whereas someone with PTSD, it's the avoidance of relationships. So getting too close to someone might trigger this because proximity with someone is related to interpersonal abuse, which means that they might just avoid relationships altogether because they don't want to get close to someone, whereas someone with BPD might have this fear of abandonment, which actually draws them to people because they don't want to be alone, and that in itself then creates tumultuous issues in relationships of volatile moods, mood swings. So it is a bit different in that regard. The second thing also would be in regard to the concept of self, okay? With BPD, we know that this is a thing of having this unstable sense of self, this unstable identity. We might see this frequent shift depending who they're spending time with. So they might change their hair, they might change their sexual orientation, their music preference, the way that they dress, depending on who they're with. With someone with CPTSD, the sense of self will be more stable and more constant. The only thing is that it's almost like it's a stable negative sense of self, so that they're always worthless, they always don't feel good enough. Someone with BPD, that might actually fluctuate. It might be, I'm the best, I suck, I'm the best, I suck, I'm okay, I'm going to change my hair, I'm going to change how I dress, I'm going to do this, that, because they don't fundamentally know who they are. Whereas the person with CPTSD might just fundamentally think, I suck all the time, no matter what. I'm not necessarily going to change my physical appearance to fit into a group. It's just, I don't like myself and I'm not good as a person. Something else, as I had mentioned, is dealing with these interpersonal relationships. Okay, so folks with BPD will have this fear of abandonment, which leads to question them, are you going to leave me? Are you going to reject me? Whereas those with CPTSD often fear this safety and security. And they might ask, am I safe with you? So we see that these are very different, right? Are you going to leave me? Am I safe with you? One might avoid relationships. One might cling to them desperately because they don't want to be left, okay? Something else too, the last main difference would be in regard to self-harm. Folks with BPD are more likely to self-harm than those with CPTSD. So the key difference, really, the main thing that we can look at to try to sort out if we have BPD, CPTSD, combination of both, where we lie on that spectrum is really looking at those interpersonal relationships, okay? Folks with BPD have this innate, deep-seated fear of abandonment. They might always cling to relationships because they want to avoid feeling lonely, whereas those with CPTSD might avoid relationships. They don't have this fear of abandonment. They actually have this fear of being vulnerable, proximity, safety to others, out of fear of being abused again. Okay, so now we have talked about the similarities and differences between these two disorders, and the important thing is what to do with this information, okay? The main thing I will tell you is to focus on symptoms rather than a diagnosis. There's pros and cons of having a diagnosis. It's good because it can help identify your inner feelings and can help put things onto paper, make it easier to communicate. It can also be negative in the sense that it can stigmatize you. It can almost put you in this box and you overly identify with this thing, thinking I am this rather than these are symptoms that I'm experiencing. So I would say focus on the symptoms, get to know yourself, do some introspection, develop self-awareness, know the symptoms that you're dealing with, and look at it from a more organic, wholesome perspective of, I'm going to pick out these symptoms and see what I can do with those. Why are those things showing up? What are they trying to tell me? How can I help to manage those things? Okay, so that would be number one, is to focus on the symptoms rather than the specific diagnosis. Number two, this is my thing that I always recommend, and I'm going to keep doing it, is to go to therapy. Okay, now we know that there's different kinds of therapies for different disorders, and this is where the utility of knowing more so where you fall on those spectrums comes into play. For BPD, I would recommend DBT. We have schema therapy. Schema therapy is good because it's also good for CPTSD, because usually we develop a schema about ourselves that we did something wrong, this is our fault, we're the reason why we were abused. Okay, so we can look at schema therapy for dealing with symptoms of both BPD and CPTSD. And then we also have things like EDMR, which is another kind of therapy, which can be good to address those deep-seated traumas, okay? I like to suggest, right, if you're going to follow a program and do DBT for 6 months, that's awesome. Also working with a therapist who has experience in different modalities of therapy so that they can pick and choose specific tools or philosophies or way of conceptualizing things to help you address the things that are coming up in the moment. Now, I know that this was just a brief overview of the key differences and similarities between the two. I'm always curious to hear from you all to let me know, if you feel like you can identify yourself in both of these disorders, and if so, then how are you dealing with that? So leave me a comment down below. I always read and respond to all of them, and honestly, it's one of my favorite things about this channel. On that note, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me today. I wish you all an amazing week, and I will see you back here next time for another episode of On the Line.